Great. Well, once again, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Sunday morning. Spring is coming. There is a lot going on in the world and in Japan. Today, we've got our star, Timothy Langley, report from a beautiful harbor in Chiba Prefecture, where he's spending the day. So, thank you very much, Timothy, for dedicating this morning to the
Thank you very
session.
much, Maya. This is our 53rd or 54th
I
live
would say
session.
55th, yes.
We just keep losing track. There's so many episodes. So thank you very much for sponsoring this. Thank you for getting the show on the road and hosting it every weekend on Sunday morning. Today we're going to talk about Japanese politics. There's a lot going on. We're live streaming now on LinkedIn, as well as Clubhouse, and you've got some other platforms that you're working on, YouTube?
Yes, YouTube as well.
Okay, so our hope here is that we're going to expand our audience and get other people involved and engaged in what's going on in Japanese politics. So I'd like to give an initial opening for the briefing today, and then at 8:30, we'll start with the formal briefing, but we'll stay on live stream until the briefing's finished. Right, Maya? Okay. So just to catch everybody up, it was a week ago today that we talked. The top items that we were talking about was Mr. Kishida and his standing in the poll. He took a little bit of a hit last week. We were talking about that and the reasons for that. Basically, that was outlined as the reaction for the slow COVID response from the Kishida administration and the issue of offering booster shots for children. Forgive me if you're getting some background noise. I'm sitting on the deck of a boat here in Katsuyama Harbor, and the wind is picking up a little bit, and I'm rocking a little bit, but I wanted to give this briefing. Didn't want to break our pattern of having this briefing every Sunday. We talked about the economic security bill, which was under consideration in the Diet. It actually passed on Friday, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We talked about Ukraine. Ukraine was kind of bubbling. It didn't look like it would happen. It looked like it might, negotiations might prevent the full onslaught of President Putin's initiative. We talked about that. We talked about the deliberations in the Diet on the potential of something like that happening. You remember the United States was really warning in very terse terms that this was coming down the path. We talked about the COVID response from the administration, the Japanese government. Entry restrictions, there was consideration of expanding the number of students, business people from 3,500 to 5,000. That was an issue that was being considered. It was considered in the Diet all this last week, and some decisions were made. I'll get into that. Korea was a part of our briefing last week because we've got an election coming up on March 9th, and I would like to give you a little bit of an update on that. So that was last week. This week, once again, we're going to talk about Mr. Kishida and his standing. Another poll has reported his drop in popularity, his approval rate, another 8 percentage points. So he's down kind of in the dumps because only 45% of the population actually supports his policies, his administration. They're not very satisfied with the response he's had with COVID in particular. He's just got a couple of issues going on there. I'm going to talk about visa relaxation. Some decisions were made in the Diet this week. The economic security bill. What's going on with the Korean elections, because that is always important to what's going on here in Japan, and also the Japan-U.S. relationship. The United States would like Japan and South Korea to be much closer together, trade, investment, and also diplomacy. So there's a lot of action going on there, particularly now with the Ukraine situation. We've got the spring labor offensive called Shunto coming up in March. March is going to happen this next week. So there's a lot to look forward to in terms of wage increases and potential controversies between labor and management. There's been some movement on the relaxation of export bans for Japanese food coming from Fukushima. That has to do with, the 311, 2011, the triple disaster here and the radiation leakage. Many countries, actually 34, 55 countries banned food from the Fukushima area. And that's been a long time since then. The Japanese government has been negotiating with many of the countries to reduce that number. I'm going to talk about that. And finally, we're going to talk about Ukraine. I think Ukraine is going to dominate our news here today. So I'm going to push it towards the end and talk about just Japanese politics. But there's so much going on in Ukraine. Maya's got some updates on that as well. So let me just get right to the briefing, and hope to keep this to 25 minutes, and then we can move on to the questions and answers and everybody else's input on some of the issues that we're talking about. The Kishida administration is suffering from yet another fall in popularity. The honeymoon is over. It's been over for 2 months, and he's in the Diet now. The Diet has just passed the economic security bill. You might remember under the Suga administration, he was pushing hard for the digital agency. He got that in February of his administration, and Mr. Kishida wants to replicate that and have his showcase for how well he can run his administration, what his designs are, what his policy is. And he passed the economic security legislation on Friday. This is a very big deal. To pass legislation that quickly only rarely happens. It happened with Mr. Suga. He got a lot of political wind as a consequence of that. It didn't save him from not being prime minister for more than a year, but it was a step in the right direction. Mr. Kishida is doing the same thing. Economic security is almost as big and as broad as what the digital agency is attempting to do, because the digital agency is trying to unify how all of the ministries communicate and share documents and save data and that sort of thing, and have it centralized so that the Prime Minister's office and the Office of the Prime Minister can monitor, control, and review and investigate without having to go through the tremendous upheaval that's required when, for example, a scandal hits or they're trying to find some information, and having to jump through all sorts of political hoops. Economic security legislation is a little bit different. It rests on 4 pillars. Mostly it's relying on economic security for supply chain, making sure the supply chain is good and secure, to make sure that the key industries, they've identified 12 key industries dealing with infrastructure. Those industries could expand, but for right now, the 12 have been identified. And so the government will be putting a lot of emphasis and budget and manpower into securing those and shoring those up. The supply chain is another area, one of the pillars to secure, to make it strong and resilient, to not suffer from something like we've dealt with during the COVID onslaught. They want to enhance the public-private cooperation on developing new and cutting-edge technologies. And finally, they want to put a lock on IP, intellectual property, that is created here in Japan from leaking out. So Japan in many past years was always criticized for robbing intellectual property from other countries, taking products and sources, enhancing them, and then putting out new products that had advanced features. The Chinese have done that to the nth degree. And so the Japanese government wants to preserve the intellectual property that's created here and prevent it from leakage. So those are the 4 pillars for the economic security. There are penalties that are being applied for people who don't follow the rules in those 12 industries. If they're purchasing, for example, devices that have been created in other countries where backdoors could be created. They'll get penalties for that. They'll get penalties for not cooperating with investigations and that sort of thing. So it's a pretty big deal. It passed the diet, surprisingly, on Friday. There was a lot of hoopla on that. You would think that the prime minister would get a little bit of a boost out of that. But in addition to the diet passing that legislation, there were quite a few other things that were going on, and I'd like to talk about that. As you know, Japanese politics is dominated by factions. There are 6 major factions. Mr. Kishida's is one of the smallest, and Mr. Abe's is the largest by far. So, although Mr. Kishida has a coalition of the secondary factions, Mr. Abe's faction is the largest, and it carries a lot of weight, and it causes Mr. Kishida quite a few problems. So, for example, 2-3 weeks ago, there was a push for recognizing Sado Island. There's a very famous silver and gold mine there. It's been in production. It's not in production right now, but it produced lots of gold and silver, and it was probably the technological marvel in mining for many decades, and the Japanese were at the forefront of that. UNESCO has identified Sado Island as a potential designated site, and the Japanese government was working towards that, and the Prime Minister thought it was not good timing for this kind of poke in the eye to South Korea. South Korea has complained very bitterly that the reason why the mine was so productive was because they used slave labor from South Korea when Japan invaded Korea and brought many workers over. The South Koreans have said that those were slave laborers, and they opposed the designation of this site as a UNESCO site. Mr. Kishida was inclined to agree with that. You remember his foreign minister is in his faction, Mr. Hayashi. So they backed away from that. Mr. Abe put his foot down and said this designation should go through. The South Koreans were not slave laborers. They were employed. They were working there. We shouldn't cower in the face of potential South Korean opposition. Mr. Kishida lost that fight, and so the application for the designation went through. Similarly, Mr. Suga, former prime minister, has a following. It's not a faction. He did have a faction. He was the first prime minister without a political faction. But since he's finished being prime minister, he's had a group of people, independent politicians, some who are affiliated with other political factions. He is upgrading that now from just a group to a team. So it looks like he is on this path to create a Suga faction. It would be the 7th faction created. I think it's probably in the works and probably will be a realization as we move towards the upper house election in July. We've got another issue that is really a sticking point for Mr. Kishida. It is the gerrymandering requirements imposed by the Supreme Court, where there are different districts in Japan where the population has decreased. Many of the people, the young people, are moving to the bigger cities, the main population centers. The older people are staying in their ancestral homes, doing the farming and keeping the fire stroke there. But the younger kids don't want to stay there anymore. So the population has been decreasing. There are 10 designated areas that have been identified that the Supreme Court has said the number of people that you have in those areas now compared to the number of politicians who represent that area is totally out of kilter. So to elect one of the representatives of these 10 designated areas, individual voters have so much weight in making that decision, whereas if you go to the other areas where the population is flooding into, the individual voters' power to decide who is going to be their representative is diluted so much that there needs to be a gerrymandering requirement so that there's a distribution, a redistribution. That means that certain of these areas that have low population will lose a member of parliament, and some of the other areas, the larger populated areas, will get representatives. The problem with this gerrymandering right now is that it impacts Mr. Abe and it impacts Mr. Hayashi, the current foreign minister. And if they follow the instructions of the Supreme Court, that means that there's a gerrymandering that is done in just before the election of the upper house, and that would go into effect the next time there's an election for the lower house. The members of the parliament who are potentially affected by that don't want it. They don't want it now. They want to kick the ball down the road and have it under review in about 3 or 4 years or 5 years, but not now. So there's a fight going on inside the Diet for proponents who want to delay that versus the proponents who want to follow the dictates of the Supreme Court and what the Parliament has already said. This is a complicated factor because in Mr. Abe's case, he has a large number of potentially affected members of Parliament now who could lose their seats. And so as a protective move, he needs to kick the ball down the road. Similarly, the former chair of the Abe faction is now the Speaker of the House. And he has also said this gerrymandering should be kicked down the road, something that's a little bit inappropriate for a Speaker of the House who has resigned from his position as a faction leader. So there's some complications going on there. Similarly, the Democratic People's Party, in passing legislation this week, the Democratic People's Party is an opposition party. They joined hands with the LDP in passing the legislation on Friday for economic security, and this caused a big brouhaha inside the Diet among their other partner opposition parties, because they were under the impression that we're the opposition, we're fighting against the LDP, and what the hell are you guys doing? You've just joined hands with the LDP to pass this legislation that we were opposed to. And by doing that, you've kind of told us that you're not really with us to help fight against the LDP. And by the way, weren't we in conversations, weren't we in discussions about when we have this upper house election, we're going to join forces, we're going to divide who's going to run in certain areas, and what the hell are you doing talking with Mr. Kishida? So this is kind of broken open. It's a big issue now in Japanese politics. What is going on with the opposition party, the Democratic People's Party? It's not a large party. The approval rating and the amount of weight that it carries in the last poll was maybe 1% or 2%. So it doesn't carry a lot of weight. But in Japanese politics, any number, any increase is a big deal. And it's not just in terms of these political parties that are fighting against the LDP or the LDP and its coalition with the Komeito. But as we've always said, and as everybody in the audience knows, Japanese politics is dominated by factions within the LDP being the largest political party. So any transition between different factions from one faction into another faction is a very big deal. That's happened. That happened just this week. So there was a defection from the Aso faction. Aso faction is number 2, tied for number 2 with Motegi under the Abe faction. So Abe is large, maybe 98 members. Aso and Motegi are tied. One of the Aso members defected and he joined the Motegi group, and it looks like he might be bringing some others there. So that tells you that Aso's weight is declining, Motegi's is rising. You can kind of expect that just given the dynamics. Mr. Aso has been in politics for so very long. He was the finance minister and the vice prime minister. He's still vice prime minister. He's turned over the foreign ministry to another individual. Actually, Mr. Abe's relative, brother-in-law, is now the foreign minister, the finance minister. So this dynamic continues to evolve and change, and you get these indicators, these signals that change is going on. And so there's a lot to look forward to between now. March is going to start this next week until the upper house election. And I've got to tell you that this situation in Ukraine is probably going to impact the LDP elections. I'm sorry, the upper house elections, and this talk about referendum and the change of the Constitution. I think it's just inevitable. The amount of change that is going to be triggered as a consequence of that is just too hard to kind of encapsulate. But we can talk about that later after the briefing. And I've gone on an awful long time about Mr. Kishida. Let's move on to other areas. I'd like to talk about the visa restrictions. So one of the reasons why Mr. Kishida is suffering in the polls is because he's been slow to react to visa applications from businesses and students, especially students. We've reported on this program in the past the anger of students and researchers in many capitals about not being able to come to Japan. These are people whose career, I mean, really are being put on hold because they've got scholarships, they've got research grants, they're going to finish their school. And when you're at that stage of your life, 1 year of a delay can really, really hurt you. With companies, similarly, it hurts them, but there are other ways to deal with that when you're making money and you're selling product. But for students and researchers, it's quite a bit different. So the diet reduced that. There's been a lot of movement now. The visa restrictions are dropping. The prime minister is being criticized because it's not enough. It's too slow, and it's not as vigorous as the situation demands. In fact, the head of the Keidanren, the Japan Business Federation, actually said that the change from 3,500 visa entrants or people to enter the country per day to 5,000 is just woefully small. It's not enough. You need to enhance that. There are a lot of problems for that. There's a lot of reasons why it can't happen. Those are self-imposed. Those are the visa procedures, the immigration procedures that everybody has to go through when they come into the country, and also the surveillance apparatus that's required right now for everybody that comes in. As you might know, if you've come in and you've taken your test and you're assigned to a hotel, they make you download an application and they check on you pretty frequently. That's a huge investment of bureaucratic labor, and that's one of the reasons why the numbers are so small. So I think, given the amount of anger that this has generated, probably in March, I think in April, we can look forward to many more people coming in. Not quite yet tourists. I think it's too early for tourists, but the numbers of business people and certainly researchers and students, teachers coming in will be enhanced this month and moving into April, as you would expect, given it's the beginning of the fiscal year. South Korea elections. We're going to have our next meeting next Sunday. It won't. The election for the South Korea president will be a couple of days after that. But already, it's an issue you should be watching very closely, because it's just rock and roll over there. The two candidates are very different in terms of personality and policies, and who is elected is going to have an impact on Japan-Korea relations. So it's a pretty big deal. They're not talking much about the Korea-Japan relationship during the elections, because it's such a hot issue. But people can kind of predict how situations, how policies, how the relationship might develop under the various administrations. So it's an area to watch. Keep your eye out on the two candidates who are there. The COVID shots, one of the reasons why Mr. Kishida is also suffering is because of his rollout of booster shots. He said maybe 2 weeks ago, we reported here, he wanted to have 1 million booster shots a day administered. At that point, when he said this about 2 weeks ago, there was about 600,000, and boosting that up is a big challenge. They just started issuing boosters at Japan universities. Hiroshima University was the first. It started on Monday, and they're administering booster shots on campus to the students. I think they're going to roll that out to all of the universities or as many as the state universities as they can to get that number up to 1 million. And I think they'll probably succeed at it. But right now, it's kind of like in the United States, we were talking about, Hillary Clinton and, the Russian dossier with Mr. Trump, but now that's kind of fallen off, and all we're talking about is Ukraine. Similarly, here in Japan, COVID was such a big issue, and I think it'll be drowned out by the Ukrainian crisis. Shunto starts in next month, but Shunto is the spring labor offensive where Japanese labor insists to management, we want more money. It happens every year. They always insist on more money. Sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't. This year, they're going to get it. All indicators are that the 4% increase that labor has demanded for an increase in wages will sail through. Toyota just announced yesterday that they have accepted, they don't call them demands, they've accepted the negotiated position of labor, and they will increase wages. That's a huge indicator of how other companies will go. Keidan Ren hasn't made a statement regarding that, but Toyota is a major player in Keidan Ren, and what Toyota does, many companies follow suit. So you can anticipate that, and you can also anticipate that the amount of controversy that's typically generated between labor and management. We want more money. You guys are stealing all our money. You're making us work for slaves' wages. That kind of animosity will be decreased and declined. And finally, I'd like to get to Ukraine. So the foreign ministry has been burning the midnight oil for the last 2 weeks, 10 days, as the issue began to boil up, and they went on full front burner probably around Monday. And you might recall that Mr. Putin did wait until after the Olympics in Beijing. That's interesting. He's played his cards extremely well. He's a very clever individual. We've got more breaking news there. I know Maya's following very closely. Inevitably, Japan will support the U.S. stance in terms of sanctions, in terms of cooperating with other G7 countries and more countries if they can get them going. But it is going to involve higher costs and more inflation. So given that expectation, the Shinto discussions have been somewhat shelved. I think even if they accept all of the demands from labor, given 6 months of what this crisis is going to produce in terms of enhanced oil costs and costs for input, Japan is going to suffer from inflation. We've had some signs of inflation. We've had inflation in gasoline costs. Remember, I was talking about the Democratic People's Party and them cozying up with the LDP. The reason why that happened was because the president of the LDP opposition party, the Democratic People's Party opposition party, received an agreement from Mr. Kishida to relax the trigger price on gasoline. So there was a self-imposed restriction on capping gasoline costs, and he's agreed with, or he's had the prime minister agree with him that they would relax that so that now gasoline costs would be capped and the government would pay the additional amount for that. And as a consequence of that, now the LDP and the Democratic People's Party have something to talk about. They have some cohesion there. So where that's going to lead, nobody knows, but it's not a very good sign for the other opposition parties. And that was because of these inflationary prices, the inflationary pressure. It looks like it's coming to Japan in a very big way. And then the sanctions that the Japanese government will impose on Russia and also on different areas of the Ukraine who have fallen under the heel of the Russian invasion. There will be immediate bans on visas, import and export restrictions, and also I believe the Japanese government has decided that the sovereign bonds will be banned from sale in Japan. That's going to hurt, but I think all of these things have been calculated in Moscow, and a decision has been made in any event. So with that, I'd like to close this part of the briefing. There are a lot of things obviously I've missed. So let's open the floor. Let's talk about what issues that you might have that we can elaborate on a little bit more, Maya.
Thank you, Timothy. Well, thank you for the briefing. Now, let's move entirely to Clubhouse so that we can continue the discussion there. Thank you very much for being on the boat, for keeping your camera stable. I know it wasn't easy. So, and of course, if you can move somewhere where it is easier for you to talk because
Okay. I hope
you
nobody got seasick.
oh, okay.
Okay, I'll see you on the Clubhouse end.
You need to sign in once again. Please do that. Okay. So
Okay,
thank you
thank you,
very
Maya.
much. See you
See you
there.
there.